Hello. World is crazier and more of it than we think, incorrigibly plural. An apt description of modern life as we've been thinking about it so far across our series, Poetry in the Turning World. These are the lines Louis MacNeice reached for in his poem Snow to capture the sudden whirling of snowflakes outside his great bay window. In this episode of Poetry in the Turning World, we're going to be talking about the weather, that favourite of British pastimes. So in between our grumbles about how it's been too cold and too hot recently, we'll see what happens when poets invite the weather into their work, from passing showers to devastating drought to the fury of hurricanes. Weather is what poets reach for when they want to commune with the elemental, the outside, the mysterious, with things hard to predict and beyond our control. Weather sets some poets chasing omens and portents, while others turn to measurements and the science of meteorology. Poems about weather confront us with scale, making us focus on things very small, raindrops, a tree coming into leaf out of season, right up to vast interconnecting systems. And since the early 90s, poets have challenged us to see if we can hold in our minds global-sized phenomena like climate change and ecological breakdown. My name is Sarah Howe, and I'm a poet, critic and poetry editor, and I'm as ever talking to poet, critic and professor of English at Cornell University, Sandeep Parmar. Hello, Sandeep.
Hello, Sarah.
Now, tell me, Sandeep, did you ever dream of being a weatherman or weather person when you were growing up?
I did not, but I remember being very kind of impressed with the idea of being able to predict weather. And in fact, I think they were, certainly in the old days, standing in front of a blank screen and pointing at various places, which they could not see. But I remember there was a wonderful weatherman when I was growing up in California called Dallas Rains. And I was like, what a great name. So if I were to become a weather woman, I would need to have invented a really great name, which I was not able to do.
Well, we're going to be looking at three poets today, Maureen, McLane, Jake Skeets and Ishion Hutchinson. And one of these poets did dream of being a weatherman when they grew up. So we'll leave our good listeners to guess which one of them it was. Another poet who did dream of being a weatherman in adult life was our poet laureate, Simon Armitage, who apparently his childhood in Yorkshire, watching the big skies and the weather rolling in, inspired him to want to study meteorology at Reading, but he didn't get in. So the Times reported that this spring they invited him back to the university to take some measurements, which is rather sweet. And they gave him a quiz about cloud types, which he failed. He said
as would I.
Alto stratus, when the answer was actually alto cumulus. Oh, Simon. But in the course of that visit, he did say some interesting things about poetry and the weather, including that his experience of translating Sir Gawain in the Green Knight brought into his mind quite how omnipresent in the British consciousness weather is, and how that poem is absolutely full of wind and rain and snow.
Yeah, I mean, weather is such a vast resource, isn't it, for poets, and has been for, as long as poetry has existed. Just thinking back to Homer, of course, and weather in the Odyssey is an event. It's really generating, and the actual action, the narrative is being driven forward by this storm or these storms and these winds that cast all of the sailors, all the Achaeans, off their routes on the way back home from Troy. And apparently, some kind of archaeological, meteorological work has been done to show that quite possibly these weather systems did occur 1200 BC or whatever it was, that might have actually shaped how Homer was telling the story, which is really fascinating.
I think I saw reference to a paper that was trying to track the exact route of the storm that sends Odysseus, of course. You've got to love the literalism of
I was going to say, given some of this is possibly not entirely true, but certainly weather was very important to poets and has been for a long time.
I think one thing we'll find today is that poems about weather are never just about the weather, are they? But I wonder, do we need to reach back to the Romantics to think about this?
Well, the Romantics are a really good place, I think, for us to go, just thinking about particularly the sort of lyric poetry that's being written even now, and the ways in which weather intersects with nature poetry, with the pastoral, with landscape poetry, thinking about Coleridge, of course, in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but also Shelley, but especially, I think, Wordsworth. And it's kind of an obvious choice, but Wordsworth's poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, is a very good example of weather. And even, it's one of the most famous poems in the English language, but we often think about that poem and we're drawn to the image of the daffodils, which people refer to it as the daffodils poem, ignoring the title and ignoring the lonely cloud. But just to give a little sample of it. I know. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. And wind was so important to the Romantics, and it appears in lots of the poems, whether it's storms or whether it's this kind of breeze that we get here in Wordsworth. But it's kind of the ways in which weather animates again, or kind of creates something, or conjures a particular sort of emotion in the poet. And we know that this kind of vivifying force of the wind, the fluttering and dancing of these flowers, is an image that was drawn from an actual walk. Mm-hmm. We also know that William Wordsworth was not wandering lonely because he was wandering with his sister. Because Dorothy Wordsworth...
We've all airbrushed a sister from a poem.
2 years before Wordsworth composes this poem, in 1802, Dorothy Wordsworth writes in her diaries, "It was a threatening, misty morning, but mild. The wind was furious. The wind seized our breath. The lake was rough. I never saw daffodils so beautiful. They grew among the mossy stones about and above them. Some rested their heads upon these stones as a pillow for weariness, and the rest tossed and reeled and danced," so we have danced here again, and seemed as if they verily laughed with the wind. And so the wind here is this really occasion for the poem. It's sort of seeing the flowers and this description that we get in the poem and also in Dorothy's diaries, but it's really the wind that begins to conjure that emotional resonance in the poem.
I've taught this diary extract many times alongside the poem, but I have to say I've not really been struck till now by that line, "The wind seized our breath." It's rather wonderful, isn't it? And it starts to mix up the inside and the outside, doesn't it? The relationship between the wind in the external world and the breath coming in or emerging out of the human body. It makes me wonder if part of the fascination of weather for poets is that it reminds us that we're embodied creatures, right? that we have bodies in atmosphere.
Absolutely, and it connects us to something that is external to us in the kind of natural phenomena like weather, but it also quickens our feelings. It gives them a kind of shape. It either creates the feeling or it becomes a kind of receptacle in some ways for the ways in which we have this kind of innermost sensation that we can't express or can't see. Cecil Day Lewis writes in his book, The Lyric Impulse, about this poem, "The daffodil poem is not a poem about daffodils, but a poem about the state of mind which daffodils set up in Wordsworth in him, answered and explained to him." So in a sense, the joy that comes out of this poem, the thing that we kind of remember, really, in addition to the image of this kind of very yellow flower, is the way in which this inner state of mind suddenly appears, and it is occasioned again by this appearance of the wind.
If this podcast has any regular listeners yet, they can start to play daffodil bingo every time we mention a daffodil.
We can't get away from him. That's true.
But when wind is mentioned in a romantic poem, the idea of the Aeolian harp is never far away, is it? This sort of symbol of poetry and poetic inspiration, this curious instrument. What is an Aeolian harp?
What is an Aeolian harp? Can you explain?
Yes, it's so I think it's like a wooden box with a sounding board and strings, but those strings aren't plucked by human fingers. They're set vibrating by the wind. So you'd sort of place it in a window to make this eerie sounding music without human action. And they strangely seem to become a sort of household accessory when the Romantics were writing. They were very popular. And so in Ode to the West Wind, Shelley calls for the wind to take over his voice and play his indolent and passive brain as if he were the Aeolian harp. And I guess it sort of conveys this idea of the poet as an instrument that's played by external forces, or that bypassing rational thought, I guess.
Harp strings are not far from heartstrings in some ways in this case. And it's interesting, too, just thinking about the appearance of the Aeolian harp kind of as a domestic object. What we also see in the Romantic period is the kind of the appearance of ways of measuring the weather. So barometers, thermometers, these are things that people begin to have. And empirical data, meteorological data is kind of being actually collected by regular people. We had sort of weather diaries, we had almanacs, we had various ways we could observationally think about the recurrence of weather or seasons or patterns, etc. But when we actually have devices, not the Aeolian harp, but interestingly, I guess other ways to try to measure the movement of something like wind or the change of pressure or, the potentially the forecasting of rain or something. That's also a kind of similarly interesting way of trying to quantify or to embody in some way the ways in which these shifts in our environment occur.
When the contemporary American poet Terence Hayes writes a sequence of sonnets called Wind in a Box, I think he must be invoking that Aeolian harp again. But the science dimension of weather and meteorology, as you say, it does seem to be taking on a new urgency in the century when the Romantics are writing. And there's one figure in particular, Luke Howard, who seems to have inspired many a poem, both then and now. Howard earned the sobriquet the Namer of Clouds, which is what adorns the blue plaque of his on his house, as it was up on Tottenham. And Howard, he was the one who first thought to name and measure and classify something as inchoate, as clouds. I guess to that point, people had thought that they were too chaotic a phenomenon to put into taxonomies, but he introduced the system of naming that flummoxed our laureate, which was sort of founded on years of deep observation, but maybe a pinch of poetry too. So cumulus from Latin for heap, cirrus from Latin for curl of hair, and all beautiful. The combinations thereof. But Howard, he fascinated the Romantics. So Goethe corresponded with him, wrote a poem in his honour. In Shelley's poem, The Cloud, his description of clouds scientifically seems to influence Shelley's own description of clouds, and he continues to reverberate now as contemporary poets like Lavinia Greenlaw and Carol Ann Duffy have written poems in his honour too.
But what do clouds really signify? I mean, it's certainly, in a way, seeing a cloud pass across the heavens is another way of measuring the kind of wind, but it's also something that is, untouchable. We can't, generally speaking, kind of go through the clouds, particularly not at this period of time. Alexander Harris's book, Weatherland, which is a fantastic history of weather across a very English landscape from the Anglo-Saxons really until the present. She writes, the immateriality of weather has made it a potent means of figuring not only our gods, but the most immaterial parts of ourselves, our spirits and our thoughts. The association between clouds and minds is so commonplace as to go unnoticed. And we even have the sort of, when you're, not the speech bubble, but the thinking bubble is a cloud that's sort of above somebody's head. And there is an interesting link, isn't there, between kind of clouds and the divine. So how weather and how the movement of clouds across the heavens, how the appearance of wind brings in this communication with something that is greater than ourselves, is also surely in this wish to name and to quantify and to understand something like clouds.
Absolutely. That one of the fascinations of weather for poets is maybe the way it forces us to attempt to articulate the formless or the nebulous. And I suppose if there was any single form of weather that was identified most closely with poetry and poetic inspiration, it probably would be clouds. Shakespeare's airy imagination, this idea of imagination dreaming, impracticality, political utopianism, even as being an airy thing and of a spirit with poetry. I think we see this in Duffy, Caroline Duffy's poem for Howard, which she calls Luke Howard, Namer of Clouds, where, like Greenlaw, she seems invested in the idea of Howard as almost a proxy for the poet. So she wants to see this sort of romantic spirit in the scientist making his observations. So she imagines a scene from his boyhood, looking out the window, staring at the skies and dreaming. Smitten, he stared up evermore, saw a meteor's fiery spurt, but loved clouds most, dragons and unicorns, Hamlet's camels, weasels and whales. So I guess she invokes Shakespeare as one of the most famous sources of the cloud as sort of proto-Rorschach test tropes, which was emblematic for the Renaissance of a certain kind of poetic invention and fertility of imagination, I suppose, seeing these shapes in the clouds.
There's also a kind of transcendence of the self too, isn't there, in being able to think about it, but also to name things. The poet as the namer of things, it feels like kind of there's a sort of Emersonian almost impulse here to try to exceed the boundaries of the human into the natural world, which can sometimes be problematic. But this makes me think then about the kind of question of pathetic fallacy, which we will look at a little bit later on. But pathetic fallacy being what? How would we describe
putting
it?
a human shape and stamp on the natural world.
It's something that we kind of associate with Gothic literature, I suppose, particularly, and how sort of changes in weather reveal kind of inner consciousness or anxieties or kind of become prognosticating tools in some ways. And I guess the kind of the example that I always think of is from Jane Eyre, Bronte's novel, where in chapter 10, Jane is kind of, she's got her wedding trousseau. She's having this kind of moment where she's going to be severed from her former self and marry Rochester. And she writes, "I am feverish. I hear the wind blowing. I will go out of doors and feel it," which is just one of the great moments of a great novel. But weather here becomes this kind of this way of trying to understand a really crucial moment in narrative, particularly in this case, but also as pathetic fallacy is kind of formulated in the novel, it gives us a kind of foreshadowing of what is going to happen. Of course, she's not going to marry Rochester. It's all going to go horribly wrong. But also this inner turmoil, which is also very, very interesting. So weather can be good, but kind of more often than not in poetry, it's not good. It often is the thing that we kind of don't want to acknowledge. It's sort of suppressed, and somehow the external world speaks to us and tells us how we're really feeling.
Well, I suppose it's got a bad rap, hasn't it? Pathetic fallacy. It's become a sort of cliche of film. Hasn't it?
Yes.
Sort of the misery that pushes you out into the rainstorm. But maybe it's a kind of magical thinking as well, the notion that the tumult inside us invariably will find a mirror in the world outside. Something almost childish about that notion.
Well, it's possibly a good time to turn to our first poem.
One contemporary poet who has thought a great deal about pathetic fallacy and its implications is Maureen McLane. Maureen is the author of 6 collections of poetry, most recently What You Want, which came out in 2023, the first volume to appear since her Selected with Penguin. And that book is a series of meditations addressed to seascapes, starscapes, plant life and microplastics that is perhaps the most close in temperament across her oeuvre to this more recent poem, Rocks, we'll be looking at today, which was first published in the LRB in January 2024. McLane is also a scholar of romantic literature at NYU and presences like Wordsworth and Coleridge and her beloved Shelley are all over the place in her poems. But she's also written about these questions in an academic vein, and in two wonderful collections of essays, My Poets and its sequel, My Poetics, aimed at a wider readership, all of which I think offer some clues as to the thinking behind this poem. Rocks. The rocks individuated as people. If you register people as individuals, which I do, haplessly, helplessly, when forced, fright or flight or love or... The plants need water. The rhododendrons are drooping. Your lust for the contemporary is understandable, but mildly disappointing. She made me a latte, today's small gift. They must be annoyed, the ones living now next to a construction site. Lorca had a lover in New Hampshire. Perhaps Mackay did too. Mpox cases explode, fade. Oh, homophobia. And now, of a sudden, rain, when I'd just told her it would hold off. I am unreliable, once again proven unreliable. The weather app is no oracle. Knowledge of, knowledge that, it is raining. It will have rained by the time you read this. There are infinite plausible sentences, by which I mean grammatical, only as long as this clause. It was a summer of cardinals. Crows bickered on lawns across the northeast. Granite outlasts us. If you bite into the beech rose's fruit, you'll find it tart and refreshing. A smaller, firmed-up, aerated tomato, all skin crunch, some seed, no juice. The rhododendrons are listless. Today's pathetic fallacy, empiricism, whatever. They want rain, watering.
It's so fascinating how in this poem we begin with rocks, which feel sort of kind of impermeable to weather. They feel like something that, I suppose does come with a great deal of history, with a great deal of, they certainly do outlast us in the way that granite does. But what are these rocks doing in the poem?
Well, for starters, it makes me wonder if we need to activate that other sense of weather in the sense of what weather does to rocks, right? Of slowly wearing them away. Yeah.
Indeed.
That ever so slowly the rocks do change and shift and vanish. But I think that the poem is invested in a sort of idea of the permanence of the rocks as opposed to the swirling, more human timescale of rain clouds and so on. So there's a sort of double timescale happening in the poem. It makes me think actually of that poem called Clouds by Wisława Szymborska, the wonderful Polish Nobel laureate, which has these lines: next to clouds, even a stone seems like a brother, someone you can trust, while they're just distant, flighty cousins. It makes me think that line from Nietzsche about how humans are hybrids of plants and of ghosts, that gives Joy Graham the title to her first book of poems. For McLane, maybe humans are hybrids of rocks and of rain clouds.
Well, you're right. I think the rocks do feel permanent, but they're permanent in the poem. But then people are also rocks, which we know, of course, don't weather in the same way as rocks. But there's also this other interesting idea, which is introduced here early on in the poem about individuation, and it actually takes me back to the Wordsworth poem, the Daffodils poem, where there's a kind of sense, and also in Dorothy's diaries, of we saw this kind of the host of golden daffodils, and the fact that they're all together, the fact that they're all kind of they have this collective noun, which maybe other people apply. I'm actually not sure. But there is also a slight anxiety in what Dorothy says, there were a few daffodils on the other edge, but we sort of ignored them because actually we were looking at this host of this collection. And we have here in McLane's poem, the rocks individuated as people, if you register people as individuals, which I do.
It's funny,
which is a really fascinating way to begin, because
it's rather tongue-in-cheek, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it must be. And then we have this really suggestive blank, which you read as you read as a sort of silence, but
Yes, it's actually a
blank.
redaction, isn't it? It's sort of underlined, followed by a full stop, that long silence at the end of the first stanza.
So we have when forced, fright or flight or love or fill in the blank.
Your blank, yeah.
What do we...
the first thing that came to my mind, I confess, was a certain F word, because I suppose of the redaction. But I guess maybe an L might be more expected, mightn't it?
Fright
leave.
Or flight or love or leave or life, possibly. But I suppose it's more kind of potent that we don't know what the word is, partly because we put in what we like, but or what we feel that we can't say. But there is also the presence of silence here.
Yes, and I think also opening up a space in which to invite the reader's imaginative projection, right? And I think that this is a poem that's very interested in projection, and this will come back when we pick up this thread of pathetic fallacy, I guess, that that joke in the opening, I wonder if to some extent it's a comment on the kind of anthropomorphizing imagination we'd need to apply to rocks in order to individuate them and tell one from another, And
then we have sort of other objects really through the poem that are more receptive to weather. So we have plants that need water, particularly the rhododendrons that are drooping. And I suppose the kind of hint there that there is a sort of drought, that there is, or at least there isn't the presence of rain. And so one is obligated, in a sense, in this kind of what feels like a kind of domestic garden, if you like, to water the plants because nature is not providing what is needed for this. And so there is this sense of desire, of lust, of a kind of wishing for. In fact, we have the word lust there in the second stanza. Your lust for the contemporary is understandable but mildly disappointing.
Well, who is that you? I assume that's us, the reader, because there seems to be another character in this poem, which is the she, right, who I take as a sort of romantic, beloved figure, the one making the gift of the latte. But the poem does turn at some points to address us directly. It will have rained by the time you read this. The second half begins, doesn't it?
It's kind of what Jonathan Culler calls, I think, triangulated address. Like, in a sense, in the lyric poem, we have this triangle of the person who is the beloved, the I, and then also the listener, or the reader, which in this case is the you. I think that's fair. But the lust for the contemporary is also interesting because it makes us think about time, as do rocks, because rocks here are timeless, but the contemporary is something that is ever-shifting. Like the weather, like a cloud moving across the heavens, the contemporary becomes more and more new. And in this case, I think the contemporary is something that we can kind of never really exist in. It feels very, it is disappointing quite literally, but it's also something that is kind of bound to disappoint us because it is always shifting and it is always changing.
Well, and maybe that comes through in the sort of news tickery effect of the stanza that flits from Lorca and Mackay's more or less secret queer sex lives
what's
to
happening there?
Mpox and Mpox cases exploding and fading, which must refer to the outbreak around 2023, right?
Yes, just after COVID.
So there is an aspect to this poem which is sort of tracking a mind floating free, like a cloud. But what is up with Lorca and Mackay?
Well, I mean, it takes me back to the redaction, really, in the first stanza. So we know that Federico Garcia Lorca was homosexual and kind of had, I suppose, this illicit relationship, which is referred to in the poem. Similarly, Claude McKay, the Jamaican poet, was bisexual, and this is a fact that I think is slightly kind of left out, obviously because of the social stigma and criminalization. And McKay had a relationship with someone which is also referred to here in the poem. But I think this, interestingly, bringing out these poets with whom we associate a particular mix of exoticism is also really fascinating. So with McKay, one of the poems that is kind of his best known poem is, I think, from 1922, The Tropics in New York. And in this poem, McKay is presumably standing in front of a kind of grocery store and seeing the kind of exotic fruits. I think it's mangoes and cocoa and ginger and things like that. And that really has kind of an incredible last line to this poem. It's a very short poem. Which is, "And hungry for the cold familiar ways, I turned aside and bowed my head and wept." And so we have this moment of very intense feeling of kind of identification with the exotic here in this sort of very, very urban space of New York City, but also this kind of homesickness for Jamaica, presumably, and also feeling as though he is, like these exotic objects, displaced. But therein is also weather, too. And Lorca, I think, also functions here as an example of someone who is displaced, obviously with Poet in New York, which is a very famous work of Lorca's. So we have this kind of, again, sort of someone who's kind of unseasonably in a place, for whom weather is, in the case of McKay with the tropics, something you bring with you, I think was quite interesting as well. But then we go into the mpox and homophobia. What do we think is happening between those things, the presence of the exotic and the unseasonable to something like mpox and homophobia? I'm interested in that.
I think it's maybe cueing us to think about queerness. It's cueing us to think about proximity and intimacy. I have to say, the more times I read this poem, the more I read it and the weather in it as a sort of allegory for the distance or proximity between the romantic partners.
Yes.
And maybe I'm cued in that by lines like the one about the crows bickering.
Yes.
But also the sort of jokey exchange about the speaker's unreliability, because she fails to predict that it's going to hold off, and it rains in the end. So rain, when I just told her it would hold off, I'm unreliable. Once again, proven unreliable.
Well, yes, because the weather app is no oracle, as we know. One can be staring at your weather app on your phone, and indeed, your very presence can disprove what is on your weather app. But I like the idea of the oracle, and I think it takes us back to the ways in which thinking about weather for poets can be a way of mediating the divine. And also thinking about the future. So the oracle here as a sort of, godlike speaker who presents a certain kind of truth or a certain kind of knowledge, which in this case is false. And that ties back into the kind of the disconnect or the unreliability of the romantic partner here.
Well, it's it's sort of like a defense through ridiculousness, isn't it? It's like, you're so unreliable because you can't be trusted to put out the rubbish or whatever. But in this case, you can't be trusted to accurately predict the weather, which is obviously to some extent impossible. But
we have pathetic fallacy appearing in the poem as well.
Yes, I think that this is all bound up in McLane's thinking that bodies are sort of sensors of weather. We, like our sinuses, can detect changes in pressure, and I think that's what's happening between the partners here. Like, it's a sort of one partner is trying to sense the mood and is almost contagiously affected by the grump of the other.
Yes.
And this is an idea that in her essay on Louise Glick in My Poets, McLane ties to pathetic fallacy, and she sort of talks about how the mechanisms of projection involved in romantic love are sort of cousins to what's going on in pathetic fallacy. But she is aware also of the sort of slightly icky aspect of pathetic fallacy in that essay. She has a bit about the dreadful writing that can come from forced engagement with nature, revolting rhetorical performances of the pathetic fallacy. I feel for you, nature, feel for and with me.
Well, it's very anthropocentric, isn't it? I mean, there is this sort of, I guess, a way, or sort of there's a pressure against that kind of projection of the self onto nature, which comes largely, I think, in a kind of eco-critical or eco-poetic turn, perhaps in the last sort of few decades. And I think that is kind of right, in a sense, that like, how far can we, particularly in an era of climate change, which we haven't obviously addressed yet, but that's something that we will be discussing, I'm sure. How much can we think of ourselves as being central to something that is shifting around us, but also that we are in a kind of very disappointing, if you like, way contributing to. And so to put oneself within that space as being kind of, being able to speak for the weather when actually one is changing it is a really ethically a very challenging position to be in.
And I think this is central to McLane's argument when she comes back to think about pathetic fallacy again in her later book of essays, My Poetics, when she's sort of arguing that advances in ecological, eco-poetical thinking and theory that sort of lead us to imagine more dispersed agencies among non-human life forms, that we're not anthropocentrically the center of everything, that this sort of breaks down the binary of pathetic fallacy altogether. And she argues for poems that engage, for example, with plants as a sort of new model for potential sympathies that might not be possible if we stick to the binary of human self and outside natural world. And I think the plants are playing an interesting role in this poem, aren't they? In that same piece, she jokes about humans being in a codependent relationship with plants. And the first time the rhododendrons come up, they're drooping, but the second time they're listless, like, I don't know, Austen heroines fainting on the sofa or something.
Well, it's definitely far from the kind of the joyful daffodil, isn't it? The listless rhododendron. But then we have that moment of today's pathetic fallacy, empiricism, ... whatever.
It's one of the brilliant moments that happens in McLane where she suddenly shifts from sort of like talking head professor to like a California girl.
Yeah, please just water them and stop talking about them. And I like the appearance of the word empiricism there, because I think it does take us back to this question around how do we measure, how do we take, kind of facts, and how do we build, and how do we prognosticate on the basis of those things. And I think that is also, where we have kind of whatever with pathetic fallacy, we also have whatever with empiricism. Like we can't really exist both in the entirely emotional turbine of the wind.
Subtweeting the Enlightenment there.
She's subtweeting the Enlightenment. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, that's a good place to shift to our next poet.
Right, which I guess is also interested in observation and measurement in its title, isn't it?
Our next poet is Jake Skeets. Jake Skeets is a Dene poet and essayist from Vanderwagen, New Mexico. Skeets is the author of Horses, which came out in 2026, and Eyes Bottled Dark with a Mouthful of Flowers from 2019. He is the third Navajo Nation Poet Laureate and teaches currently at the University of Oklahoma. Horses, which is indeed just out from Akoya Books in the UK, is the book from which our poem today is taken. This poem meditates on climate change and climate justice, and does so through quite a grisly discovery, which we'll discuss in a moment. But this is a kind of an interesting poem that I think is taking some of the themes, particularly to do with empiricism and data and thinking about climate change specifically. So this is Surface Mapping by Jake Skeets. In the beginning, breath wind, more wind, as if breath, a doing of sky, its name on the wind, but it doesn't rain anymore. I remember snow chest high on the horses, their bodies marooned and dark across the white space. Letters splashed on the face of a forgotten sky, pignon shells singing on a plastic tarp, the darker marks across my back. There is no water. I can't breathe through the smoke haze, the fog, a burden of time layered like the tree rings on my fingertip. This is how they will remember us. Water barrels and basins, coal burning in the lungs, dust pneumonia, a shifting sand dune. A dune field, dry steam bed, sand on little snow, evaporation rates, silt at the bottom of muscle spasms, where words are beetles. I happen across a dead crow, a dead horse, and still deer soften.
So this is a book that circles around again and again to this image of the horses.
Yes.
Like a sort of traumatic flashback, really. And yet we encounter the the story. I think it was a news story that the poet encountered in a newspaper, actually, only in a note at the back of the book, which is quite interesting, that deferral after we've had the many dream iterations of the image. So what happened, Sandeep?
So, yes, I mean, I alluded to that, the grisly story, but apparently there was a discovery of 191 dead horses that were found mired in mud. That in a place which used to be a stock pond, which I guess is a kind of reservoir, presumably.
Yeah, I think it's a pond where cattle would have been watered.
Been grazing. So these horses were all stuck in the mud and died, and some of them were kind of in motion, some of them, had died in motion, and some of them were kind of piled on top of each other. So it was a very, very sad thing that happens. It's on Navajo land in Arizona. These horses were presumably lured in by thirst, and so there was a kind of backdrop here in terms of weather, of drought, of a kind of unseasonable time. But in a sense, there is a sort of also this resonance of climate change. And in addition to that, another layer of this, which is, of course, the historic mistreatment of the native people and the ways in which their water supplies have been, across the United States, have been kind of disrupted by various sort of governmental interventions, et cetera. So all of these things are kind of working together. And then we sort of come back to, I think, in this poem, some of those ideas through this question of surface mapping, which is...
Why is the poem titled that, do you think?
Well, I suppose that there are many reasons, as there are with all good poem titles. But surface mapping is, I think, quite literally, in geographical sort of geological terms, it's where one assesses kind of risk. So you can see kind of flood levels, flood plains. It's a way of thinking about how a topography will quite literally manage various forms of weather, or kind of the absence of water, etc. So in a sense, we have in the poem thinking about the presence of this
pond dried up to mud.
Yeah, this stock pond, but also the ways in which water is kind of handled or mishandled, or is also very much there. But of course, in a poem, we're also thinking about other potential metaphorical kind of reasons why we have this. And there is, of course, I think throughout the poem, a thinking about space, about land, about the ways in which the relationship between land and the body of the kind of human figures here, but also the horses are interrelating. It's also a way for us, I think, too, as we will do now, to sort of think about what is beneath the surface, what is below the surface of what is happening in the poem, in terms of the occasion for it, which is, of course, this terrible discovery, this mass kind of death of these horses. So it invites us to do a non-surface reading, to think about how we might map the poem and the events of the poem against the physical map in which these kind of, if you like, weather-related events have occurred.
I think it becomes apparent from the other poems in the book, and they do sort of work together with the horses as a linking leitmotif, that what's especially unusual and destructive about this drought is that it's happening in winter. And yet it's pretty clear that there is no precipitation, there is no grace of rain or snow in this poem. And actually the same note I mentioned at the back of the book, the poet describes the decision by the Navajo reservation authorities to, I think they decided to bury the horses in situ. So they sprinkled the corpses with quicklime to make them to speed decomposition. So the snow here is not snow, is it? Snow, I remember snow chest high on the horses, their bodies marooned and dark across the white space. That snow, which might feel scenic and picturesque at first, is actually something altogether more horrifying here.
Yeah, it's a false season in a sense, isn't it? And there's something interesting about Skeets as well as a poet that we haven't mentioned yet, relating back to our conversation earlier about the weather. And Skeets has a particular interest in the weather, doesn't he?
He is the poet who dreamed of being a weatherman. He's actually a wonderful essayist also, and he has an essay called Summer Light, which I think in its meditations on his experience of the changing climate on the Navajo Nation land and the sort of growing desertification and sand dune migration on the reservation, is quite a useful proxy for thinking about this poem.
Mm.
And he talks in that essay about having been obsessed with the weather since childhood. But I think it's quite refreshing that even though he does have extensive experiences on the land communing with the elements, he says that fascination came of absolutely loving that film Twister as a boy with Helen Hunt and Bill Paxton.
I remember that.
So it's not sort of mystical Native American wisdom so much as wanting to crash tornadoes through his toy cars, at first at least. But he does, in that essay, say, weather, after all, is a kind of poetry, but if I'd been a weatherman, I might only have learned to make meaning of the weather, whereas poetry taught me the way to take things we cannot understand as a kind of meaning-making. That's interesting, isn't it?
And also the ways in which things are left kind of unstated, unsaid, left open. And I suppose in a way, what we've sort of seen maybe with the Romantic poets is this intense meaning-making. And that's where pathetic fallacy falls down, is the wish to absolutely harness whatever form of weather, whether it's wind or, et cetera, rain, and to try to draw something conclusive. And in a sense, I think what we have here is delightfully inconclusive. And there's space in that in the book, because this is a poem, as you say, like from a much longer sequence. And so I suppose that the resistance to jumping to a particular kind of knowledge about weather is what the poet is thinking about here in terms of kind of meaning making.
He also describes in that essay falling in love with the sort of quasi-scientific terminology of weather. So he talks about listening to all the weather channels on loop for the diction they employ, like mesocyclone. Do you know what one of those is? Dry line, wind shear.
We should ask Simon.
But he also talks about the new vocabularies that climate change force us to learn. So triple-digit heat index was not a phrase I thought I would ever use, despite writing this essay during an excessive heat warning. And I think these scientific vocabularies leave their mark on this poem as well, don't they?
Yeah.
Particularly in that penultimate stanza where the poet turns prophet and gives us this horrific vision of a future marked by scarcity, snow evaporation rates, silt at the bottom of muscle spasms.
Yeah, and there's a kind of wonderful mixing of the human and the animal world here, which we have throughout the poem, but I think here it really begins to take off. And even in the syntax, having the kind of the colon and then the sort of listing of things, and even as the experience of reading it, you almost feel breathless. And I think there is obviously breath here at the beginning of the poem. And how does the poem turn breathless? How does the breathlessness of the poem turn into wind? How do we think then about the ways in which the embodiment of this particular kind of shift is a form of violence? Because we really do have violence working throughout the poem. And in a sense, that's, I guess in keeping with the ways in which wind has always interceded into our imagination, but here it is interceding into the body and the bodies of the animals. It connects us as humans to the animal world. In the beginning, breath, wind, more wind, as if breath is really just that very close connection again. But then there is also this description of the horses' bodies, which I find really moving and fascinating and recurs throughout the book. Marooned and dark across the white space. And just how it's very difficult, I suppose, to write about animals too, because one, again, anthropomorphizes them, projects one's emotions onto them. But these horses become sort of statuesque because they are frozen. The kind of the event, the weather event, has frozen them in time. So they become this way of thinking metaphorically about, as you say, what will happen to us, how we will be remembered. Will someone be sprinkling quicklime on us in the future?
Well, and the dark marks against white, it's like the landscape is becoming a sort of writing, if only we could, almost like Foucault's Discourse of Signs, if
letters.
only we knew how to read it. So, yeah, the words as beetles later on, but also the darker marks across my back, which I think elsewhere there's a preoccupation with scars on the body in the book, which is maybe telling given its interest in histories of mistreatment of native peoples. But I wonder if the darker marks might also be tan lines, that weather is something that touches and shapes and changes our bodies quite literally. and makes our experiences legible. I think there's something really interesting happening with the burden of time layered like the tree rings on my fingertip. That there is an aspect of this poem that's interested in memories and archives, like the mention of the wind, the in the beginning, that feels like a origin myth, doesn't it?
Yes.
And in the notes, Skeets mentions the Navajo elders talking about how the cycles and patterns of the wind used to reliably bring the rain, which is not the case. But it doesn't rain anymore. I think that's one of the most simple and devastating lines in the whole poem, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is there's a term for this, which is solastalgia. Which is a very recently coined term, as you would expect, because I guess, well, perhaps this is a more recent experience, but it is basically feeling homesick when you're at home. So in a sense, being able to exist in a place where you could reliably predict particular forms of weather or seasons, or at least know that it was going to rain or snow, and now seeing those changes, so seeing drought and seeing shifts in weather patterns or trees that don't fruit, whatever it is a kind of solastalgia. So we kind of have that here, I think, which is that shifting anxiety and then thinking really about the future. There is a sort of prophetic, as you say, nature, particularly with the sorts of language that are being used. I happen across a dead crow, a dead horse, and still deer soften. I find that it's offset from the poem, isn't it? In a kind of almost sort of triadic.
Yeah, there's something of the haiku following the haiban in it, isn't it?
Yes.
The sort of crystallization into image as you get in that traditional Japanese form, which would move from a more prosy, well, literally prose, into something crystalline.
Are these the words that are Beatles? Is that what's happening there at the end?
It might well be, mightn't it? That it's the prophecy is literally legible in the landscape, I suppose. And speaking of deciphering things in the landscape, back to the burden of time layered, we talked about the sort of geological time scale of McLane's rocks and the granite, and I guess layered. That word does make me think here of sedimented time in rock, as might be legible or visible in the arid desert landscape of Arizona, Utah, where the Navajo reservation is, or indeed actually layered could be those ice cores, couldn't it? That let climate scientists
that
see
indicate
into past epochs. Yeah. But then it shifts the metaphor, doesn't it, or the simile into like tree rings on my fingertip. So you have the whirl of the fingertip, like the tree ring, but tree rings are themselves, of course, a sort of archive as well that you can see in tree rings in a record of environmental conditions like drought and so on, and that's somehow programmed into the fingertip too.
Absolutely. As something that's, again, very individual. So there's sort of the collective, and then there's the highly individual, which is the fingerprint. I'm interested in this is how they will remember us. Because we talked about, with McLane's poem, the kind of the you, the she, and the I, but here we have a they. And the they feels like a kind of future.
It's the future generations, isn't it?
Yeah, sort of looking back. But also feels kind of almost unsympathetic in some way too. The they is someone who is not us. The they is someone who is making potentially possible the kinds of man-made climate change, like the coal burning, the dust pneumonia, et cetera, et cetera. So the they almost become sort of sinister here at the same time.
Well, I guess this is an element in certain strands of indigenous thinking, isn't it? The idea of the seventh generation, that every decision made by the group, one has to decide whether it's appropriate to lift the fish from the river and how many to take, because you think about the consequences of that decision with the seventh generation. And the idea of being able to hold in the imagination those really distant people and think of them as related to you or not is sort of bound up with the indigenous approach to something like climate change as opposed to the Western ways of conceptualizing that, I guess.
I
just
wish...
can't think of those
No.
future generations.
I wish we could. That would probably solve quite a few problems. But I suppose it's a kind of way of ending our thinking about this poem. It's also worth noting that in the notes, Skeets tells us that of the horses that died, one survives. And the name of that horse is
Grace.
Is Grace.
Though they're wild horses, so I wonder how... He doesn't explain how she comes across that name. I presume she's named posthumously, isn't that? Sorry, not posthumously, because she's survived. I presume she is named because she's taken in and tamed after the disaster.
And Grace survives. So what survives is Grace. And I think this again takes us back to the divine, that somehow this horse surviving becomes the sole witness, really, to what occurs, but also has been saved by God.
Yeah, right, yes.
And for our final poet, we have Ishion Hutchinson. Ishion Hutchinson was born in Port Antonio, Jamaica. He is the winner of the 2025 Rilke Prize for his book-length poem, School of Instructions, for which he was also shortlisted for the 2024 Griffin Poetry Prize. His other collections include House of Lords and Commons, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for Poetry, and Far District, which was his first book, winner of the Penn Joyce Osterwell Award, as well as a recent book of essays called Fugitive Tilts. He is the recipient of a prestigious Wyndham Campbell Prize for his poetry and is currently a professor in the Department of Literatures and English at Cornell University. The poem that we look at today, which Ishion Hutchinson has kindly read for us, is called After the Hurricane. It is from his 2017 collection, House of Lords and Commons, which was published by Faber in the UK.
This is Ishion Hutchinson, and I am reading After the Hurricane. After the hurricane walks a silence, deranged, white as the white helmets of government surveyors looking into roofless shacks, assessing stunned fowls, noting the inquiries into the logic of feathers reversed like gullies still retching. They scribble facts about fallen cedars spread out like dead generals on leaf medallions. They draw tables to show the shore has rearranged its idea of beauty for the resort villas, miraculously not rattled by the hurricanes, call it Cyclops, passage through the lives of children and pigs. The one eye that unhooked banjos from the hills, smashed them in Rio Valley. They record how it howled off to that dark parish, St. Thomas, stumping, drunk with wire lashes and cramps, paralyzing electric poles and coconut trees, dishing discard among neighbors, exposed, standing among their flattened, scattered lives for the first time. It passed through Aunt May's head, upsetting the furniture, left her chattering something a cross between a fowl and a child. They can't say how it tore down her senses. No words, packing their instruments, flies returning to genuflect at their knees, on Aunt May's face, gone soft. No words except, don't fret, driving off as if they had left better promises to come.
There's a sort of trace here, isn't there, of Shakespeare's Tempest?
Well, I suppose many Caribbean writers have found themselves writing back to that as a sort of locus classicus of thinking about the new world and its uncontrollable forces. So I wonder if howled in Hutchinson's poem might be a echo of the howling roarers of the waves in the opening of The Tempest. I guess maybe there's a distant echo here of the idea of the storm erasing rank in the tumult of the sailors being temporarily on a par with or even more powerful than Shakespeare's nobles, in the way Hutchinson's Hurricane passes through the lives of children and pigs equally with no distinction. But then rank is preserved here in various crucial ways, isn't it? So
the dead generals.
Well, yes, and the poor roofless shacks versus the tourist resorts which remain untouched. So the shore has rearranged its idea of beauty for the resort villas miraculously not rattled. So there's a sort of two-tier economy here, one of which is much more devastated than the other.
Because what we have here really is the aftermath of a hurricane, presumably in Jamaica. And as you rightly say, there is a kind of, there are two different kinds of experience of this hurricane that are being described really in the poem. But the kind of occasion of the poem is the hurricane, is this terrible force of wind, which presumably is to a certain extent expected, forecast, but one never really knows the extent of devastation that a hurricane will bring. And that is, of course, a source of anxiety. But we also have, as a kind of occasion for the poem, or the way into the poem, these government surveyors who feel immediately disappointing. And we kind of know that whatever work they have come to do will be largely ineffectual, and that these people will have to make do with whatever they receive, whatever aid they receive, and they will have to rebuild. But quite rightly, as you point out, these two different experiences are the experiences of people who are Jamaican people who live there, who have lived there for a great deal of time, and then also the kind of presence or the appearance of these villas, these resorts, which presumably are kind of dotted around the coast. I haven't been to Jamaica, but I assume that is the case. And that they are, as the poem tells us, miraculously not rattled. So the construction of these resorts withstands the force of the hurricane. But we know from the ways in which the homes of those who live in Jamaica are flattened and that the roofs are kind of coming off, that is not the experience that they are having.
I find it fascinating the way the opening to the poem demotes those white helmeted surveyors as the representatives of the government here. They're hived off into a simile, aren't they? So they are mentioned as white as the white helmets. So we begin with the silence, don't we? After the hurricane walks, the silence deranged. So in the space before the poem, we have the tempestuous noise of the storm. Yep. But then the silence is not a restoration of calm, is it? It is itself deranged, as if the whole scene is quivering still with the devastation.
Absolutely. And the poem is kind of struggling, not struggling in a sense, but it's kind of trying to apprehend what has happened. It's
shell-shocked, isn't it?
It's sort of doing what the government surveyors are should perhaps be doing, which is to assess the damage. And the poem assesses damage, and it assesses damage of different kinds. So we have the stunned fowls, and the kind of, interestingly, noting inquiries into the logic of feathers, which is a sort of almost a kind of tongue-in-cheek way of thinking about how do you begin to think about what has happened to these presumably kind of chickens that have
well, though I do wonder if those are the people, actually. Well, the way that Aunt May is reduced later to her stunned silence and chattering a cross between a fowl and a child. I wonder if those are the Jamaican people. And it makes you think that there's a certain cruelty to the eye of the observing consciousness in this poem, wherever you attribute it.
Well, there's a sort of cruelty almost that's being taken or borrowed from the perspective of the government surveyors. But then there's also a kind of tenderness as well. And Aunt May is just a wonderful kind of character, and she's very beautifully, even though she's described as the hurricane is described as passing through her head, which I think is quite.
She's very much the emotional heart of the.
She's Aunt May's face gone soft, who then is kind of sort of stunned into silence by this because her mind has been upset by the passing of this hurricane.
Upsetting the furniture is brilliant, isn't it?
It's brilliant in a way. You kind of imagine her mind as this sort of the house in which of course, the hurricane has moved through. And it's a different way of thinking about pathetic fallacy, isn't it, really? Because it feels, again, more violent, more... it feels as though something is kind of done to her, as opposed to her, creating a sort of communion with this wind, with this weather. But so we kind of have both, don't we? Have a sort of blend. But the prevalence of things here is extraordinary, and the ways in which this hurricane is kind of described as a cyclops, which I guess we can kind of visualize, can't we?
Well, yes, it's single eye, but I think that's the clue here, that the literary father figure who's most present in this poem isn't Shakespeare, but is Derek Walcott, right?
Yeah.
That Walcott has a poem called Hurricane,
Yes.
that must be sort of an intertext being gestured to quite self-consciously, in that not rattled by the hurricanes, call it cyclops, that insertion there. In Walcott's poem, the cyclops is sort of pointing to the indigenous Caribbean language Taino, which gives English the word hurricane. And it's almost like the sort of revenge of those native erased peoples, almost the hurricane in Walcott's poem, the epicanthic almond-shaped eye of the whirling cyclops that will rage till we get your name right, that it's sort of been forgotten and mangled by history, this Caribbean force.
And the cyclops kind of hovers here between sort of the human and the kind of bestial as well at the same time. And we sort of, I guess, have that a little bit in the, going back to Shakespeare, the kind of post-colonial critique of something like The Tempest, where the one who is Caliban, who is the most connected to nature and in a sense, is kind of nature as opposed to kind of a force that is imposed upon it. There is this question of kind of who is native, who belongs, who can speak for the land, who can speak for the space. And even with the tourist infrastructure, Walcott kind of comes back here, because in Walcott's poem there's the luxury resorts, return to the spear tips of candles. So that's certainly one, through the mythic, through the epic, kind of ancestor to the poem. But there's also the other poet here, and I think that Hutchinson's poem is kind of sort of melding a lot of different traditions.
Yes.
But the other poet is Cama Brathwaite, the Barbadian poet, who also kind of thinks about hurricanes, and in fact thinks about hurricanes in relation to the poetic act, and writes in his book of essays, History of the Voice, the hurricane does not roar in pentameters. And that's such an interesting phrase, isn't it?
Well, in the wake of Brathwaite, hurricanes become this rather emblematic thing in Caribbean poetics, don't they? This notion that pentameters as an inherited form and measure from Western colonial European traditions is not adequate to capturing the Caribbean experience, that new rhythms need to be found. And Brathwaite finds them in something he calls nation language, this idea of a way of speaking and making poetic rhythms that will be inflected by African traditions as opposed to sonnets and pentameters.
Yes. And in a way, I think with Hutchinson's kind of broad, more kind of, wider, over a broader work, we see the melding of both of these things. We see a thinking about, he's in many ways a poet who understands form extremely well, who understands rhythm and meter, and you can hear that in the reading as well. But on the one hand, we have Brathwaite's The Hurricane Does Not Roar in Pentameters as a way of thinking back to, as I say, this traditional English meter. But then we also have in Walcott and Sea Grapes that kind of, one of the most famous lines of that famous poem, which is about the boulder, I think, isn't it, that makes the great hexameters come. So thinking about hexameter as a kind of, classical epic meter as a way of thinking through narrativizing history, a people. And so in a sense, there somewhere in between these exists a poem like this that is conscious of rhythm, of movement, and the ways in which a history and a voice and a breath, the idea of a sort of a particular kind of catastrophe or an event, can be somehow narrativized through particular forms of meter.
So in a poem like this, Hutchinson is almost invoking two fathers to Caribbean poetics in the form of Brathwaite and Walcott, and letting them jostle without resolving the conflict, I guess. That he is very much the inheritor of both. But I wonder if the introduction of meter and the idea of meter as a kind of measuring takes us back to those government surveyors and their instruments, which futilely scribble facts and draw tables and record. It reminds me of the work of another Jamaican poet of a slightly older generation than Hutchinson's, Camilla, and his book, The Cartographer Tries to Map a Way to Zion, where the Rastaman is set against the Western mapmaker surveyor, who just can't get the hang of the terrible meter of hurricanes.
Yeah. Yes. And I suppose that it takes us back to empiricism as well, that, what are the collection of data and facts going to give us here in the aftermath of something that is felt in such a human way? I'm drawn to, again, to think about wind with the one eye that unhooked banjos from the hills. Banjos are a very particular instrument within kind of Jamaican musical traditions, and have a kind of long history within Jamaican music. But the banjos here, are they a kind of Aeolian harp?
Well, they're certainly silenced, aren't they? They're smashed. And in our delving into the history of banjos in the Caribbean, we discovered that they were sort of improvised instruments in plantation history, weren't they? That they were made of the landscape by necessity, hollowed out from gourds or made from animal skins. So to some extent, they're an emblem of the landscape itself speaking and then being silent.
Yes, because there is that line then that follows it. They record, so even though they are smashed, they record how it, presumably the hurricane, howled off to that dark parish, St. Thomas, stomping drunk with wire lashes and cramps. So again, the anthropomorphizing of the hurricane as the Cyclops, but then as this kind of stomping drunk, and how the banjos that are sort of silenced, in their silence, record the movement of this terrible
Well, I
weather.
do wonder if those cramps and lashes, that's Caliban again, isn't it? Being punished by Prospero. So the storm here, in somewhere between human and beast, is like a tortured Caliban figure. But Caliban is also there in Aunt May and the fowls, who have their higher faculty of speech and reason removed. That's what Prospero says. I taught you language before you met me. You were this inarticulate beast thing.
Yeah. And what do we make of don't fret? Because we have no words appearing twice here, don't we? We have, they can't say how it tore down her senses, no words, packing their instruments. And then we have Aunt May's face gone soft, no words, except, and in italics, don't fret.
Yeah,
and then they drive off.
Parting platitude from the government, isn't it?
It's a very strange thing to say. You don't expect government surveyors to say don't fret.
I mean, does it have a particular Jamaican colouring, do you think? Do you think it is a common utterance? We'd have to ask Ishion, wouldn't we?
I don't know, but I mean, fretting is an interesting idea. Fretting is has a kind of musical meaning as well.
Well, yes, I guess maybe it's a pun on the stringed instrument and the banjos again. Nice.
Don't play. Yeah, thank you. Don't play the song. Don't fret. Don't. Yeah, possibly. And then in the absence of words, in the absence of language, we also have the silencing of music. But of course, what's wonderful about the poem is that what we have here is we have both the words and the song in the poem. So it comes back. He frets. So I suppose what we've come to really in thinking about weather, or different kinds of weather particularly, but also what weather comes to symbolize for poets, how it is used in the hands of contemporary poets, is that weather isn't so much a kind of fleeting atmospheric phenomenon as something that is inherently relational. It's a way of tracking relationships between people or between us and the idea of nature, and that we can't kind of artificially separate ourselves from the experience of being in the world. And being somehow enacted upon by the forces of nature and of weather. In our next episode of Poetry and the Turning World, we'll be thinking about poetry and its relationship to food. So expect poems about food alongside poems in which no bites are taken at all. And our poem from the archive next time will be a section from the late Tony Harrison's now iconic but once controversial poem V, which first appeared in the LRB's pages.
If you've enjoyed our conversation about poetry today, perhaps you'd consider subscribing to the Close Readings podcast. Mark Ford and Seamus Perry have various wonderful series on poetry there that you might enjoy. And listeners can get 25% off by using the code Poetry25. You'll find a link in the description.